All right. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Sid Wolfe, who's back to the DCRI. This is the second or third time he's been gracious enough to come visit us. It's not really because he wants to come visit us. He wants to visit his daughter and have dinner, but that's okay. Sid's had a very interesting career. He's a physician who was working at the NIH in research, and as you'll hear during the talk, got involved in a safety issue in terms of recall of some years back, and actually began to work on how do we improve the safety, in this case, remove a defective product from the marketplace, how do we get the federal government to respond when there's a safety concern, and actually began to do that full time with someone named Ralph Nader at Public Citizen. Ralph Nader's gone on to other things. Sid stayed at Public Citizen since then, heads the health branch. And most significantly, for the last year or two, he's now on the FDA Safety Advisory Committee, where he works with Dr. Harrington.
Judy's on it also.
Looking at, there's now a separate safety process at the FDA, and we'll hear more about that. Sid's been gracious enough to actually meet with Duke Medicine and Fuqua students in Washington every year in our Week in D.C. trip. And as a crass advertisement, we've been talking about trying to put together a mentorship program for third-year med students if they want to do research and advocacy in Washington for a year. So there's still a chance left for next year. So Sid, thanks for joining us, and welcome.
Okay. I will, as Kevin suggests, I'll spend a few minutes, maybe 3, 4, 5, explaining how I yanked myself out of my comfortable academic career, which I had been in for about 10 years at the time this episode I'll talk about happened, and then go through some examples, including one that is sort of hot, current this week of safety problems that are not being adequately addressed. I came to NIH in '66 at the end of my first year of internal medicine residency because I was strongly opposed to the Vietnam War and everyone was getting drafted. There was a doc I know who had angina, abnormal EKG, was drafted. He hadn't had a big MI yet, but they said he's okay. So there was a 100% chance I was going to get drafted, and I didn't want to go to the war. And luckily for me, and probably for the Army, I had spent most of my time in medical school doing research, and I published some papers, so I was able to get into NIH to do clinical research and some molecular biology research. So I had a very nice 5 years there. If I had it to do all over again, I would do it again, because I think you need to do research in order to be at least a little better able to evaluate research. So this whole thing begins in, it's actually probably the week before that. 71. I got a phone call from a physician who was an EIS officer in the CDC, Epidemiological Intelligence Service officer, and he said, "Do you realize that half of the intravenous fluids in the United States are contaminated?" I said, "Yes," and I assumed, just a matter of time before they recalled them. And he said, "No, that's why I'm calling you. They've decided not to recall them, and instead they're going to leave them on the market." And he was calling the day before an MMWR, which was dated the 13th, came out and said, basically, keep using these infected IV fluids, and if your patient gets septicemia, then you should stop. And I said, I don't believe that they're going to say anything like that. And he said, I'll fax you, thermofax those days before the new kind of fax. And this is what the MMWR, at the first suspicion of septicemia, which might be associated with these contaminated IVs, this literally what it said, then you should stop the IV fluid. And I said, why aren't they recalling them? And he said, because Abbott has convinced the FDA and the CDC that there would be such a shortage of intravenous fluids that would be a public health disaster that would far outweigh the problem here. The problem at the time I learned about this was 150 cases of septicemia and 9 deaths. Ultimately, there were 100 deaths and thousands of cases of septicemia. From an epidemiological standpoint, it was easy to figure it out because it was an extremely unusual kind of Enterobacter cloacae or Erwinia it was called, either of those. And so every hospital that got cases, they said, oh, all these 4 people were getting Abbott IV fluids. Let's stop using Abbott IV fluids. And they switched to some other ones. This was just the further statement about in the MMWR. These solutions are essential for patient care and cannot be withdrawn before replacement is in hand. And so this guy is saying, is there something you can do about this? He knew that I knew Ralph Nader. And I said, well, I'll do research, because that's the main thing I know how to do. And all that there was there were some MMWR reports showing Hospital A had 8 cases. They stopped using IV fluids from Abbott, and there were no more cases. So the causality was unequivocal. It turned out that they had changed the liner in their screw cap and introduced this bacteria somehow or other. So I said, what can I do? So the thing that came to mind, because I thought Abbott was probably lying about the shortage of fluids, I called all the other IV manufacturers in the country. I said, how much do you have stockpiled? And they all gave me figures, which turned out to be quite correct, and decided that we were going to try and get these things off the market, even though the FDA and CDC and Abbott had jointly put out this foolish refutation of preventive medicine in the form of this little statement. Going forward 26 years, in 97, in an issue sort of commemorative, if you want to call it that, issue of MMWR, they said that this was the largest and most lethal known outbreak of nosocomial infection associated with widespread distribution of a contaminated medical product in the history of this country, and it still is. So 100 cases of septicemia, largely preventable because these hospitals that had toppled on this association, it was months before this recall. So it was clear to me that the reason for not recalling was completely invalid, and so we wrote this letter, mainly Ralph put in a couple of sentences just to make it sound more formal or legal or whatever else, and this is what the letter said. This was Charlie Edwards, a very nice guy who's now probably 95. He's emeritus at the Scripps Institute in La Jolla. And this is what the letter said: urgent plea for immediate preventive action to save lives and injuries. And the thing that struck me the most, and which is, I think, characterized a lot of these subsequent fights we've gotten into, is clear, unequivocal evidence of a serious problem, but not using its powers to do something about it. That's it. And this letter, this is on a Sunday, the 21st. And we delivered this letter to the FDA offices, and we delivered it also to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post, and to all the networks. And that night, on Sunday night, we were on all the evening newses, and it was in the front page or close thereafter in most major newspapers in the country on Monday. And the initial response by the FDA and the CDC and the Abbott and lockstep, oh, we can't recall it because there's going to be a disaster. And they were all recalled the next day. And I was astounded. I'd hoped that we could make some difference, but I was shocked that it happened so quickly, like the day afterwards. And this is really the precipitating event for me leaving NIH, because as soon as this happened, I was still at NIH. I was not to leave NIH for another bunch of months. I started getting phone calls from people saying, well, you think that's a problem? It is. A pediatric cardiologist at the FDA called me up and says, here are some drugs that I have raised some questions about, database, and they aren't paying any attention. And in fact, they moved them out to some Siberia-like location in another part of FDA in response to his raising these questions. And so I started getting all these, why don't you do this, why don't you do that? And I was really too afraid to give up my academic career. I'd by then been doing things for 10 years, all through medical school. I took a year off in medical school to finish some research I was doing on chloramphenicol toxicity, and all during my residency I'd done it, and all at NIH. And so I just, I don't know if I can do this. So I did it nights and weekends for a few months, and it was just clear that this was something that needed to be done. There really wasn't anyone doing this from an independent focus, as in not in the government or not in the industry or whatever else. And so I left, and I wound down my NIH research, and the group officially started in November of '71, and I left NIH at the end of that year and So I've been doing this is the 39th year now. So this is, it is not as easy as this sounds. HRG is the Health Research Group. We don't work on things unless they're really serious problems. So we're much more likely to work on occupational lung cancer, and we've done a bunch of things successfully suing OSHA to set safer workplace standards for various carcinogens than a skin rash. I mean, skin rashes are unpleasant, but they're not as severe. We don't work on things unless large numbers of people are affected, like the Abbott intravenous fluids. It was half the people in the country who were getting that intravenous fluid as opposed to other ones. Available, reliable data. Cannot understate the importance of that. Some data is available but not reliable. So we will come across data that may fit into some idea that, well, that really is a problem, but if it's lousy data, we don't want to look at it. The other side is that there's some reliable data that, at least in the old days, was not very available. And so back about 9 or 10 years ago, we sued the FDA to try and force them to put in the public domain information that they were giving to people on FDA advisory committees. About 1 out of 4 drugs that get approved by the FDA go through an FDA advisory committee. And in the old days, before our lawsuit, I would go as a member of the public to an FDA advisory committee meeting, and I would raise my hand. I would have 2 minutes to say something. The problem was that I had never seen any of the data unless it happened to be published, which it usually wasn't, until the day of that meeting. You know, I would see the FDA presentation and the industry presentation, and we sued the FDA under something called the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which is what constitutes the basis for having advisory committees. It says that any government agency that's going to have outside advice from people other than the employees of the agency has to do several things. One, they have to announce the meeting in the Federal Register 30 days in advance. Two, the meeting has to be open to the public unless there's some legitimate trade secret going on. And there have been some instances where our meetings were closed, and they really were legitimate trade secrets. And three, there has to be time set aside, an hour, for public participation. And we sued them, arguing that there cannot be meaningful public participation if you haven't seen the data. And the lawsuit, from their perspective, was a loser, and they didn't even adjudicate. And they settled the case, and starting back a few years ago, they started putting the data up on the Internet. All of the internal documents that we get sent as members of the advisory committee a month in advance was going up on the Internet 24, now 48 hours in advance, and now sometimes it's even more. So people, anyone else who wants to comment on what is going on in the advisory committee actually can do it in a data, evidence-based way. So simply to emphasize the importance of availability of data. We've also sued FDA to force divulging of other kinds of data, like the protocols for some of these post-market studies that they do or are claiming that companies should do after the drug is approved. Like, we don't work on anything unless there's a really strong likelihood we're going to change things. There are some things that there's zero possibility. And some of the projects we do, which have nothing to do with the FDA, we're just trying, and Wednesday morning we're going to publish for every hospital in New York their C-section rate, primary C-section rate, VBAC rate, and the percentage of deliveries by midwives to really beat up on most New York hospitals for what is really an epidemic of C-sections. In some hospitals, over 1 out of 2 deliveries are by C-section. There is no regulation of that, so to speak, but the idea is to try and get information out so that women can try and stay away from those hospitals that are just sort of doing what we would call gratuitous violence to women for unnecessary C-sections. We don't work on things that are going in the right direction, likelihood of change by us. So, for instance, the Abbott intravenous fluids was going in the absolute wrong direction, and so we worked on it. There are other things that look like the FDA is going to do the right thing, which they do a lot of the time, and we don't want to get involved in those because there are too many things that are just going in the absolute wrong direction, and I'll give you a bunch of examples of those. So that's the criteria for selecting. The methods are sort of, at the first end, traditional. Most of our data analysis is secondary data analysis. Sometimes we've done surveys. We actually did a survey in the late 90s of FDA medical officers to find out what was going wrong then. They were approving twice as many drugs as they'd ever approved, and drugs that shouldn't have been approved got approved and then were taken off the market when they caused enough damage, which was known before approval. Anyway, so The petition and the estimating of risk is a letter to the FDA that Abbott IV fluid would be a petition. Now, more formally and much more data available, we will petition the FDA to put a black box warning. I'll show you an example of that, or to take a drug off the market. We have a litigation group of 10 full-time attorneys. It's all they do is sue the U.S. government. They don't handle malpractice cases or product liability cases. Occasionally state governments, but only the U.S. government. We've had 55 of our cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. They are a really good group of people. Several of them know a fair amount about the FDA. And so when we've sued to try and open up documents, they help us out. If they do not respond to a petition, we can sue them, and they help us out there. We used to, but haven't recently, had clearinghouses for plaintiffs' attorneys to help them get technical information about what they were working on. We don't do that anymore because a lot of the information that we used to provide them, we've now forced the FDA to put up on the Internet, so we don't do that anymore. And we only did it when companies were literally criminally liable for what they had done and where we'd already done work on. Education information. At the same time that we're telling the FDA to do something about a drug, we're also trying to educate people. I mean, I am an adjunct professor of medicine in Cleveland at the medical school, and I'm on the faculty at Hopkins at the School of Public Health. We have residents doing rotations with us. We have a newsletter. We have a book called Worst Pills, Best Pills, which is sold, I think, 2.5 million copies, and we have a monthly update of the book called Worst Pills, Best Pills News, which has a circulation of about 180,000. It's one of the larger circulating newsletters on drugs. We've published a bunch of books in addition to Worst Pills, Best Pills. We published maybe 100, 120 medical journal articles, more in the last 25 years. The first few years I was trying to figure out what to do, how to do it. I'm still learning a lot, but at least we have time to write more medical journal articles now. Most of the things, other than occupational health, which the media doesn't seem interested in, get a reasonable amount of attention, which means that people get warned about things before we have been able to succeed in getting them taken off the market or warnings on them. So I'm going to go through these categories that we have looked upon as the problems with FDA and the industry, devices, but I'll mainly talk about drugs. The first category is failure to adequately ethically test products. I'll go through two examples. One is the U.S. government itself, and the other is a company with almost the complicit participation of the FDA. The third example, it will come later in the talk under failure to regulate, because it is both a failure to regulate and it's an incredibly unethical study that is, as we speak, recruiting patients, which needs to be stopped. Anyway, the first two. In 1997, my colleague Peter Lurie, who was doing a fellowship out in San Francisco at the time, and who had spent a year with us as a medical student back in 84, called me up from the Côte d'Ivoire, where he was looking at a HIV intervention trial, and said, "You will not believe this." It's a frequent beginning to sentences I hear from people. "You will not believe this, but the CDC is funding a study in the Côte d'Ivoire." This is 3 years after the publication in the New England Journal showing that AZT reduced perinatal HIV transmission by 2/3 versus a placebo. That was a study that needed to use a placebo because they didn't know if it worked. They didn't know the damage to the infant and mother. But 3 years later, he is telling me that the CDC is funding a study where some of the women are getting placebos, completely unethical. And I said, I wonder if there are any other studies that are funded by the government. So came up with 18 studies. 2 of them were in the United States. No placebos involved at all, because if you tried to do a study like that in the United States, it would be a riot. But in developing countries, of the 16 trials, 15 of them had at least one placebo arm. This is after you know that it prevents a life-threatening, fatal disease. And so we sort of went public with this as soon as we got the data on these 16 companies. We usually had a press conference and accused NIH, which was funding some of the studies, and CDC of doing something that was just completely unethical. And as a result of this, I got a call from Marcia Angel one day, who was the editor of the New England Journal. She said, "We'd like you to write a sounding board piece for the New England Journal." I said, "Okay, we want to get more attention, and we really want to stop this from going on. Placebos are obviously necessary, critical when we're talking about things ranging from pain to allergy, a bunch of other things. But when you're talking about life-threatening diseases where you have a treatment, it's not a good idea. And these were the data behind it. This is the article published in 1994 in the New England Journal. It was called ACTG 076. And what you can see is that it was a randomized placebo-controlled trial, because it had to be, because they didn't know whether this would work or not, whether it was dangerous. There was a 2/3 reduction in the arm that got AZT as opposed to one that got the placebo. Very striking. The thing I noticed in that paper was one sentence that said, and I noticed this looking back on the paper after we learned about these trials going on in Africa and elsewhere. There's one sentence that said that their pre-hoc protocol had the design of the study look not only at placebo versus AZT, but every time two women came in at any point in their pregnancy, they got randomized to get a placebo or AZT. And that meant that women who were only first seen a week or 2 or 3 before pregnancy were equally in the study. So, in other words, the study was looking not only at effectiveness versus a placebo, but it was also looking by prior design at the extent to which duration of treatment affected it. And in the paper, published in 94, it said clearly duration of treatment had no effect. In other words, it worked no matter what time you gave it in the pregnancy. And that was key because a lot of these placebo-controlled trials were looking at different durations and everything, and that it's already been answered. So a little bit like calling, it's not quite like calling intravenous fluids manufacturers. I called the statistician for this study and I said, could you give me the data upon which that sentence was based? And he gave me the data, and these were the data, which had not been published in this paper at all. And the paper was remarkably well done, and they made the statement that they just didn't have the data. And these were the data. But now, same study, these are data that I got 3 years later. They stratified, again, this was their pre-hoc, not post-hoc analysis. We are increasingly intolerant of people that change the primary outcomes after the study is done because they didn't work at all. Anyway, this is the pre-hoc decision, less than 12 weeks, greater than 12 weeks. So the left-hand pair of bars is the less than 12 weeks, and the right, and you can see pretty much the same, 2/3 reduction no matter what duration of therapy. Anyway, so that's the first instance, and when this was published, Marcia Angel had a very strong editorial supporting our findings and saying, when you're talking about life-threatening diseases and you have a treatment, you cannot do a placebo-controlled group. You just can't do it. You can do different durations, and the one study in those 16 out of this country that didn't use a placebo was a Harvard Thailand study, and the researchers there, Marc Lallemant, a French internist, said it would be completely unethical to do a placebo, and they refused to do it. NIH tried to talk them into having a placebo-controlled arm because it made all the other studies look kind of bad, but they didn't. And they actually learned more from that study than they did from the placebo studies, and didn't kill off a bunch of infants either. So here's another example, example 2. You all know what surfactant is. It's necessary. It's one of the reasons why cesarean sections aren't a good idea, because instead of being able over a period of labor to develop surfactant capacity, it doesn't work. I mean, for necessary cesareans are necessary. We're going after the probably third that are unnecessary. So premature small infants have respiratory distress syndrome of the newborn. And to their credit, companies developed some treatments, 2 synthetic and 2 biologically derived. The first was approved in 1990. And we get involved in this. This is back in 2001, because someone from the FDA calls me up and they said, you will not believe the meeting I went to yesterday. I said, tell me what it was about. You'll see in the next slide what it was about. But this is a company funded largely by Johnson & Johnson, Discovery Laboratories, a good name for a company. And they wanted to have a 5th product called Surfactant, a synthetic one, 4 already in the market. And it was clear this is a remarkable breakthrough, not their product because the other ones were already approved. Huge reduction in neonatal mortality, most thoroughly studied new therapy in neonatal care. Cochrane collaboration can't do placebo-controlled trials, would be unethical. FDA itself conduct of a placebo-controlled trial would be unethical in the United States. And in Europe, at least, this company designed trials with a comparator drug, one of the previously approved surfactants, versus their surfactant. So far, so good. But this is what this guy was calling me about. Oh, wait a minute, just slight before we get to that. This is just all the studies that have been done or published. Orange bars, placebo-controlled, because up until the time the first one was approved, they just didn't know if it worked at all. But starting with 91, there was only 3 more placebo-controlled trials, with all these other products going through clinical trials. And the last one was in 96. So we are in 2001, and this is the title of the meeting, literally. And I said, I don't believe that the FDA would be stupid enough to have a meeting titled that. And they said, I'll send you the PowerPoint presentation. We're past thermofaxing, so they're able to send. And this was the title of the meeting. Use of placebo controls in life-threatening diseases is the developing world the answer. And most of the people at this meeting thought that the answer was yes, it is the answer. And the context was specifically this product, and the company wanted to do trials in Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador in which at least one arm was a placebo. You've got 4 comparator drugs in the market. The company itself is doing comparator trials in Europe, but in the developing world, it's obviously easier to show that something is better than nothing than that it's better than another product. So we said, we've got to stop this. This is a few years after the AZT one. This case, none of the trials had been begun yet, whereas with the other one, a lot of them were underway. Some of them got stopped after we made this sort of ugly publicity for the FDA and for the CDC and NIH. And this one, we just wrote a letter to Tommy Thompson, the wonderful, pleasant person who was head of HHS then. And we said, you can't allow these studies to go on. They're completely unethical. There's no excuse for them. And we also wrote to the health ministers in these countries, figuring that they had not been told that this was going on. And the only letter we got back was from the Bolivian health minister, who said this study would be totally prohibited for legal, ethical, and social reasons. And we generated a lot of very nasty publicity for this company and for the FDA, and they decided a couple months later not to do any trials in which there was a placebo. It is now April of 2010. This product has not been approved yet. It probably will get approved soon, but just to say that doing non-inferiority studies, it's a little more difficult to show that something is not inferior or whatever to another product and that is better than a placebo. So it's taken a long time. And meanwhile, there are 4 other products on the market that people can use. It's not like it's the first breakthrough product. So that was the first category, unethical studies, and I'll show you another current example under the failure to regulate category. This is a short category, failure to report results to government agencies. This is one medical device, the Bjork-Shiley heart valve, which was approved in 82. We petitioned to take it off the market in 84 because it was killing huge numbers of people. It was defectively designed and manufactured, and the little disc, the tilting disc, was breaking off, throwing people into heart failure. And there's still about 20,000 people with these implanted, and we're involved in a big fight to try and force Pfizer, that owns this company now, to do preventive prophylactic removals of these valves before they fail. So one device, 3 drugs. Cellocrine was a SmithKline Beecham, now Glaxo, drug. It came off the market before Glaxo bought the company. Oraflex, a Lilly drug. Meritol is a Herx drug. Several characteristics that these products have. They all were approved without the FDA knowing fully about their dangers. 2 of the 4 came off the market in 1 year or less, when enough people died of things that the company knew was already occurring before approval, but they hadn't told the FDA about. The 4th one took about 2 years, and the Bjork-Shiley heart valve took about 2 or 3 years. The other thing that they have, and the FDA admitted that none of these would have been approved if they had been told fully what was going on, as opposed to not fully. And all these companies were successfully criminally prosecuted for what they did. paying nickel-dime penalties. Nobody went to jail. 2 physicians in Philadelphia at SmithKline did community service, which, that's better than just paying money that someone else pays. But I think there's probably less of this going on. It's hard to tell because only if you got a hold of documents. The first one was the Celocrin. We made a free information request to the FDA right after it came off the market because the FDA was commending the company for having been so responsible. And what we found was there were a bunch of adverse reaction reports that had occurred, liver and kidney damage, before the drug was approved that the company didn't exactly let the FDA know about. And the dates were on these things. And we said, instead of commending the company for this, you should be criminally prosecuting them, and they did. So this is the main category that we spend most of our time on. I'm not going to do stuff on advertising. It's interesting and at some level funny, but sort of sick. So we'll stick with government failure to regulate. And that's where we spend most of our time in terms of, like the Abbott IV fluids. They had all the information they needed. They had all the authority, and they just had been talked out of doing anything by Abbott for invalid reasons. And as a result of this, this is the problem. I mean, there are too many instances where there are products on the market. I mean, you could say the Abbott IV fluids could have had a little label like this. It's approved by the FDA, but watch out. There are too many instances where, I mean, if drugs need to stay on the market because they really have some unique advantage, they should stay in the market, and you should put warning labels on them and whatever else the FDA can do, which it now calls risk management, REMS, whatever. But there are too many ones where there's nothing unique about the drug other than it's uniquely dangerous, and so those are the ones we spend a lot of time on. This is a letter, this is an article written by our former employee, Josh Sharfstein, who's now the number 2 person in the FDA. He worked for us as a medical student for about 4 or 5 months before he started medical school. Terrific guy, and he should know better than what is going on in some of the drug area. This is a very good, attractive, unprecedented way New England Journal article written in June of 2009. Overriding purpose of the FDA, protect public health. Some benefits are not worth the risk. I'll show you some examples of that because I wrote a letter to the 2 of them a few weeks ago reminding them that they had said that and giving 3 examples that completely refute every principle in this letter. One of the greatest challenges facing any public health agency is that of risk communication. The public must trust the agency to base its decisions on science. Cannot be overemphasized. Judy Kramer knows that. Bob knows that. I mean, you just have to do that. And if you don't make decisions based on science, the trust is going to be decreased, and that's not good for an agency that's part of the Public Health Service. So here's one of the 3 examples. We petitioned to ban this drug 30 years ago, 1978, propoxyphene or Darfon. At the time, there were already lots of reports of people dying from accidental deaths, taking often not terribly much more of the drug than was recommended. The drug is barely effective. I mean, in a bunch of randomized controlled trials where you compare the combination of propoxyphene and acetaminophen, which is what Darvocet, still sold, is called, to just acetaminophen, there's almost no difference. There's one study that actually showed a statistically significant improvement. Mainly, it's not better than acetaminophen alone. And compared to a placebo, in some studies it isn't any better than the placebo, and in some it has very weak analgesic effects. So our petition 30 years ago was denied. The company was Lilly then, and they mounted a huge war on me. The very funny article in the New York Times pointing out that they canceled their Christmas vacation for all the employees after we filed this petition and a bunch of stuff. Anyway, they denied it. But we decided to go back at it when we learned that Britain was taking it off the market about 5 or 6 years ago. And so we filed another petition in 2006, and the FDA didn't respond. Either way, they didn't deny it, they didn't accept it. And under something called the Administrative Procedures Act, if the FDA doesn't respond to a petition, you can sue them not to force them to do A or B, but to force them to do one or the other. I mean, the lawsuit is not to take it off the market. The lawsuit is to say, you have unreasonably delayed. That's literally the language of the law. Respond to us. And after we sued them, they responded and they convened a meeting, which Judy Kramer was at. I had to recuse myself from the advisory committee because we had a lawsuit against the FDA on this very topic. So the meeting was on January 30th, January 30th in 2009. And this was the FDA's presentation at that meeting. They were acknowledging that from an efficacy standpoint, it just really didn't work very well. This was my presentation and confirmed by the DAWN, the Drug Abuse Warning Network in NIH. Just focus on the related deaths. Related deaths means that someone thought that one of the reasons someone had died was DPX, dextropropoxyphene. And they're mainly accidental deaths. I mean, if a drug doesn't work and you take twice as much because it didn't work, and it has a very long-lasting metabolite that is cardiotoxic, it causes conduction delays, norpropoxyphene, and the half-life is several days. And so if you only take twice the amount, you can start piling up huge amounts of the metabolite, the norpropoxyphene, even if the drug itself is not at high levels. So not surprisingly, a lot of these were accidental. I got some data that I don't know why the FDA didn't have it. It was publicly available. I got it from Florida, where I've been told that they had done a much more creative job of trying to associate possible causality between drugs and deaths, homicide, suicide, whatever else. And so in 2003, the chief state medical examiner instructed all the medical examiners, anytime there's a suspicion of a drug, do a pharmacologic autopsy, blood, tissue levels, and everything, A, and B, as a function of what level is there. And in this case, including the metabolite, which in chronic use cases is there at high levels much more because it's got a long half-life. So they determined that of the deaths, and these were deaths from 2007, it was present in 3/4 of them, but it was actually the cause, their phrase, cause of death in 1/4 of them. In other words, the levels of one or the other were high enough to have accounted for the death. And these were the data from the 4 years from the time that they had started doing this. Green bars are all related deaths, and the orange bars in one state are the ones caused by dextropropoxyphene. And for about 1/4 of them, there was no other drug around. So we're talking about 70, 80, 90, 100 deaths a year in one state, which is about a 15th or 16th of the country. Unlike prescriptions for Avandia, which I'll show in a couple of minutes, these have stayed up there. It's one of the 30 most prescribed drugs in the United States, mainly generically. And, you know, it doesn't work at all, and it has no unique advantage whatsoever, and it is still on the market. The FDA Advisory Committee voted. I was given a half an hour because I couldn't be on the advisory committee because it was a conflict of interest to present things. And the advisory committee voted, I think it was 14 to 12 that should come off the market. The FDA, in retrospect, made some sort of unseemly efforts to swing the vote in favor of leaving it on the market. One of the people at the FDA, Kurt Roseborough, said to the advisory committee, well, yeah, they've taken it off the market in the UK over 2 years, but we can't do that here, which is absolutely wrong. I mean, once the FDA decides that they want to ban a drug, companies have what amounts to 1.5 years or 2 to ask for a hearing, and they have all kinds of due process during which the drug stays in the market. And I think that the vote may have been different if he hadn't said that, because I could not say anything once my 30 minutes were up. I had to sit there and bite my tongue and listen to this kind of stuff happening. So that's one of the 3 examples of things that should come off the market and sort of refute those statements by Peggy Hamburg and Josh Sharfstein. This is now out of place because the first petition was in 78. This is in 87. This drug came in the market, Suprofen, an NSAID, and it was uric, which is interesting but doesn't really have much to do with its pain-killing properties. And it came in the market in December of 85, and the FDA started getting case reports of one of the euphemisms of all times, acute flank pain syndrome, equal acute renal failure. And I got a hold of these reports. I actually published a little series of cases in the New England Journal once I got these reports. The first 51 cases of acute flank pain, mainly people 30, 40, 50, 18 hospitalized, 17 with hematuria, average creatinine of 3.03, mainly previously healthy adults taking it for athletic injuries or whatever else. And because we had filed this petition, the FDA had an advisory committee meeting, and Bob Temple, who is generally very smart, made this not very smart statement that, well, we can't take this off the market because doctors have to have as big a choice as possible. I mean, 15 NSAIDs aren't enough. You have to have 16 or something like that available. And we, partly the New England Journal little letter or case review that I did, and just partly other bad publicity that we generated, it was taken off the market. The company was also, I think, getting sued, but it had no unique advantage. It had unique, very unique, acute renal failure shortly after taking a drug. Another quick example, this is a drug. Irritable bowel syndrome is a unpleasant disease. It is highly related to people who may also have fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome. These are diseases that, as you know, there is no pathology found at all. They are symptomatic. Norton Hadler over in Chapel Hill at UNC has said that these are people who have really difficult time coping, and all three of these could be looked upon as what we used to call psychosomatic, now psychophysiological diseases. Because of that, they have incredibly high placebo response rate. So in the clinical trials on this drug, allocetrone, Lotranex, on a scale of 0 to 4 for abdominal pain, one of the main problems that these people have, the change was 0.1 to 0.24 to 0.14 more than a placebo. And when we got involved in this, there were already 54 cases of ischemic colitis reported to the FDA, some requiring surgery. And so we petitioned to ban it, saying the disease is unpleasant, but it's not progressive or life-threatening. There's no pathology there. But the treatment is, and the benefit risk is completely against the drug. And so we petitioned to take it off. It was taken off the market, and a bunch of people said, I need this, and it was put back under an incredibly restricted distribution system. So I would say that maybe 0.5 to 1% of the people that were getting it are getting it now. And that's okay, but you're getting rid of most of the cases of ischemic colitis. I was forced, I have 4 daughters, as does Bob Harrington, and one of them, for a number of years, ran the primary care internal medicine residency program at Hopkins at Bayview. And so every once in a while, she convinces her old man to come and give a talk to the residents. So a week ago last Friday, I gave a talk to the residents about some of these things, some other things also. And they said, well, they're going to be taking the board, so why don't you make up some board-like questions? So before getting into the slides that I have, this is the slide on rosiglitazone or Avandia. First drug in family to be approved? No, it wasn't. Clinical evidence of effectiveness? No, none. Causes bone fractures 2 times in randomized controlled trials. Macular edema? Yep. Reversible when you stop the drug. This is just a manifestation of the systemic edema. It has profound effects on sodium water receptors in the kidney, and these people get heart failure. That's the thing that has been well documented for about 10 years now or more. And it's been banned in one country. 3 weeks ago, it was banned in Saudi Arabia, not a country that we normally think of as being progressive, but they're sure ahead of us on Avandia right now. So the first one that was approved and then banned in 2000 was Resolin, troglitazone. But the FDA waited to ban it until they approved Actos and Avandia, because they wanted to have one of these insulin-sensitizing glitazones, as they're called in the market. Why, I don't know, because the drug's really, again, no clinical benefit. We asked the FDA in 2000 to strengthen the warning enormously because there were already a bunch of cases of heart failure, de novo and worsening of heart failure. And then there are these studies by GSK and Steve Nissen showing, meta-analysis showing or purporting to show an increase in MI. FDA has an advisory committee meeting on this, which we asked for the drug to be taken off the market. These are just some of the things. We published a series of 20 cases of liver failure, mostly fatal, with Actos or Avandia in pharmacoepidemiology and drug safety last summer. And so, it is, as I said, it's in the category of regulatory failure, even though there's a really unethical study, which I'll get to in a second. Yeah, I'm going to finish. Time for some questions. We petitioned to ban it in October of 2008, and around the same time, unprecedented, the European American Diabetes Association said, don't use this drug. I don't think I there's any drug they've ever said that, because like many organizations, they get lots of money from drug companies, and they don't like to say things like that because it may not be appreciated by the companies. They had a meeting in December 2008 where they decided, well, we've had problems with these diabetes drugs. Maybe we should at least try and assure that they don't increase the risk, even if they don't decrease the risk. But they punted on whether it had to be done before or after approval. So this is a study published in the British Medical Journal last August. One of the many advantages of the preferred health system that we like, a single payer, is that you have a single database. So in Ontario, they have a database that has everything that's happened to every patient, inpatient or outpatient. It's a little weak on the drugs because they only have drug data on people 66 or over because in Ontario, the reimbursement is different for them. So they've got a huge database. And so they looked at this database for people that had started between April 2002 and March 2008, outcome measure composite of death, hospital admission for AMI or heart failure. So they had 39,000, almost 40,000 patients started on one or the other. And when they sent this paper off for publication, the editors of the British Medical Journal said, are you sure this is not a randomized controlled trial? Because they had a chart showing the characteristics, and they were just identical. Because when you have a population-based data set, there isn't any particular reason why different people, the drugs were pretty much equally prescribed during that interval. And so, anyway, the composite outcome was reached in 5.3% of patients taking PO and 6.9%, highly statistically significant. Adjusting for demographic, clinical factors, lower risk of death also. And they did not find, like the meta-analysis, there was anything in terms of the MIs. And they concluded, this is the conclusion in their published paper, given that rosiglitazone lacks a distinct clinical advantage over PO, continued use may not be justified. ISIS is something that I had heard of, but I actually went up there and gave some talks a couple of months ago. They have 100 people working there. They are funded almost entirely by the Ontario Ministry of Health. And they look at this whole data set, and they publish about 70 papers a year. Most of them are not on drugs because whereas they're limited to people 66 and older on the drugs, for everyone else, they've got everything going there. I'll show you one other example, and then we really need to take some questions. This is their ultimate conclusion. CHF, both of them, secondary to renal sodium retention. The receptor strength is stronger for ROSI than it is for PO. No difference in MI. And this is their conclusion in the paper. Risk per million patients above the risk of using PO if you used for a million people ROSI, 8,300 excess CHF, and I think it's 2,500 excess deaths. Prescriptions did go down. We still have 2.5 million people, prescriptions rather, in the U.S. last year. So for a drug that has absolutely no unique advantage, there's no study showing that it is less dangerous than PO, and a bunch of studies, including this one by the company. This is a study, an interesting study. The design was anyone who had diabetes and was taking either metformin or a sulfonylurea, but wasn't adequately controlled. So half of them get randomized to get the one of those two drugs they weren't taking. If the sulfonylurea people get randomized to add on metformin and vice versa, the other half get randomized to get rosiglitazone. And what you can see is sequentially, these are years, the composite outcome, heart failure, hospitalizations, and deaths adjudicated, starts diverging very quickly. The upper line is the rosiglitazone one. So now we come to the third unethical example. There's a trial going on right now, recruiting 16,000 patients, randomized placebo-controlled trial, looking at two things. One, rosiglitazone versus pioglitazone, and then submerged in there with another couple arms is vitamin D or not vitamin D. And so TIDE is thiazolidinedione intervention with vitamin D. TIDE. Never end finding new acronyms. Sponsored by the company. If you read this informed consent sheet, which I sent to Bob Harrington a few days ago, you would not know that this drug is as dangerous as it is because they don't bother really telling a bunch of things about rosiglitazone. It's sort of like this informed consent sheet would make you think that the study is at equipoise, and it just isn't. Final drug, and then we do have hopefully time for some questions. This is the third drug that I wrote to the commissioner and Josh Sharfstein saying, how can you leave these drugs in the market given two of them have been taken off the market in other countries, including this one recently, Darban, the other one, and one of them's been taken off the market in Saudi Arabia, but that hadn't happened by the time I wrote the letter. This is a weight reduction drug put on the market in the late 90s. Is essentially a twofer. It has two pharmacologic sites of action. One is an amphetamine, hence sibutramine. The other is a serotonin. It was sort of, a replacement for fen-phen, which was two drugs, one of which had a serotonin effect and the other an amphetamine. We petitioned to ban it back 8 years ago for two reasons. One, pre-approval randomized trial data, and two, post-approval ADR reports. This is the pre-approval randomized trial data. Tachycardia, palpitations, high blood pressure, clearly worse in the people that randomized to get this drug. The FDA Advisory Committee voted not to approve it because they were concerned about these very things. The FDA medical officer who reviewed it said it shouldn't be approved, said the sibutramine unsatisfactory benefit-risk ratio, so forth. Further said that this aggravates some major obesity-related comorbidities like hypertension and things like that. And there were some significantly abnormal EKGs amongst the ones that were found almost exclusively in the group getting sibutramine. The other factor was that there were a bunch of MIs in very young people that had been reported after the drug came in the market. They did not respond to our petition. In those days, we weren't smart enough to sue them right away, so we waited. And 3 years later, they responded, and they denied our petition, saying there's this big randomized placebo-controlled trial. We want to see the outcome of that because that will really answer the question. The SCOUT study, a study not ordered by the FDA but ordered by the European government because they were also concerned about the pre-approval RCT data and the cases. And they told Abbott, if you want to leave your drug in the market, you're going to have to do a huge randomized controlled trial, placebo-controlled trial. And so the FDA is telling me, or us, in 2005, wait for the results of the study. The study results came out last November, and it showed it was 10,000 people, half randomized to get placebo and half sibutramine, statistically significant increase in the composite endpoint, MI, stroke, resuscitated cardiac arrest, or CV death, sibutramine. And based on this and yet more young people MIs, we repetitioned the FDA several months ago in December to ban it again. Not long after our petition, the EMA, the European Medicines Authority, banned it. The FDA, though, the basis was, again, the results of this study and the adverse reaction reports. The FDA said, no, we're not going to ban it. We haven't analyzed the data. They'd analyzed the same data that the EMA did, but the EMA decided to take it off the market. And they were saying, well, a lot of these people had label contraindicated conditions. None of them had recent MIs or strokes. They were exclusion criteria. And they said, we're going to have an advisory committee meeting in the fall of 2010. The EMA said, ban it. No one should prescribe it anymore. No one should fill prescriptions of it. And they essentially responded to what the FDA had said by saying, this risk also applies to, quote, the off-label use in people who are being prescribed the drug because they're obese and overweight, because they are obviously at increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Skip those over. Last example. There are hundreds of cases of tendon rupture caused by, not just associated with, fluoroquinolones. And we noticed this. Look, we have the whole FDA adverse reaction database. We went through it, 250 cases of tendonitis, 262 cases of tendon rupture. So we asked the FDA to put a black box warning on a med guide, which is an FDA-approved labeling, unlike the other 99% of labels that you get that the FDA doesn't approve at all, and to warn doctors. They didn't respond, so we sued them just about 2 years ago to force them to respond one way or another. And in this case, they responded immediately and said, yes, you're right, we're going to put a black box warning on. But it took a lawsuit, and this is completely preventable. The idea was, if you are taking one of these drugs and you start getting tendinitis, you should call your doctor and say, I'm getting tendinitis, and they'll switch you to another antibiotic, which is fairly easy since none of these drugs are really first-choice drugs. Levaquin used to be thought to be first-choice drug for community-acquired pneumonia, but it isn't anymore. This is another study they published. I don't have time to go over that, but this is just a brief summary of some of the drugs that we warn people don't use in our newsletter or book, and then 2 or 3 or 4 years later, they were taken off the market. I mean, our warning was based on sort of the same reason that they were eventually taken off the market, just that the FDA didn't regulate promptly. And this is just a summary of the last 38 years, more or less. We don't easily and casually ask the FDA to ban a drug. We've done it 33 times in 38 years. Most of them are off the market. Some of them have very limited use, like Lotronex, and a few still widely used. This is just, we do training, medical students, residents, post-residency. That's it. This is, if you need to get in touch with me, that's my email address, and these are the 2 websites. One is the online version of the book, which is updated every 6 months, and the other is all of our other projects in occupational health and other things. Questions? Not a lot of time left, but nobody has any questions. I don't believe it. Yes, Judy.
Sid, I think that was extremely helpful to get the whole historical background of the organization and have these actual examples. I found myself wondering, and I've never really talked to you about this, what your
You are now.
what your current analysis is of what the fundamental problem is. In other words, do we need to have a public citizen group continually forever into the future? What's the fundamental problem where we get into these situations where there's the need for a public citizen group to raise this? Is this individual error? Is it bias? Is it influence of? What is your current analysis of the root cause problem?
There are a few root cause problems. One of them, which people don't like to acknowledge, is that in 1992, because of budget tightness, Congress passed a law called the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which essentially has the drug industry giving money directly to the FDA to pay for what is now most of the review functions. This year it's over $700 million in cash going directly from drug companies to the FDA. It pays for about 70% of the review of drugs. And there's nothing, it's not corrupt drug by drug. That's not what's going on. It's changed the whole attitude. We did, which I can send you sometime, we did a survey of medical officers in 1998. We got data from 50-some medical officers, a much higher percent than the FDA did when they did a survey a couple years later. And they were complaining that the standards had been lowered for safety and efficacy after 92, that 27 instances were cited where they, the medical officer, had said a drug was too dangerous, shouldn't be approved. This may have been one of them, the sibutramine, and it was approved over their head. They were explicitly told at FDA advisory committee meetings, you shouldn't say things that are too negative about a drug, like the companies and saying things that are too positive. So a bunch of stuff like that. So PDUFA is certainly a culprit. Another culprit is the leadership in CDER, which is terrible. Janet Woodcock came in 93, around the same time PDUFA, and I met with her regularly. She's been at FDA for 16, 17 years, and during most, except for the time she was in the commissioner's office, she was the head of CDER, and she is now. She doesn't like to regulate, period. And she would come down to our office, I would go out there, and I stopped meeting with her after a year because she said, I don't see why we have to get into these antagonistic relationships with industry. I said, how about the fact that they have some asymmetry about getting drugs approved and everything? She just is uncomfortable regulating, and she's on the wrong side of the propoxyphene, of the Avandia, the sibutramine, and she's got people right under her, not all of them, but enough of them that do that. So there's a serious leadership crisis. The one which is just as bad in the device division has been addressed. They've gotten rid of the head of devices. They're going to have a lot of work to do because unlike drugs, which at least has had a couple really good leaders since it at least since we've been doing this, they never have had anyone good in devices. And so they have brought in Jeff Shern, who's a good guy, and make it turned around. They're doing better things in food. I mean, the letter that I sent a few weeks ago was saying, hurrah, you recalled thousands of products that contained a bacterially contaminated textured vegetable protein without one person being sick or one person being killed or hospitalized. That's good preventive medicine. What about these 3 drugs? I mean, what's going on here? None of them has any clinical benefit at all, and they have huge risks way out of proportion to other drugs in the category and just generally out of proportion. So second thing is leadership. And the third is grossly inadequate congressional oversight. In the earlier era, back in the 70s and 80s, one Senate subcommittee, the Senate Small Business Subcommittee, held 135 days of FDA industry oversight hearings in a decade. It's 13 a year. We haven't had 13 FDA oversight hearings in the last 5 or 10 years from all of the Congress, and that is important. The reason we have a tripartite government is so that one part can act as a countervailing force to the other, and if it doesn't do it, it doesn't do it. So FDA has escaped largely, other than the one person in the Congress that's doing oversight is Charles Grassley, a very conservative Republican senator. And he has done more oversight than the entire Congress combined, consistently. I mean, he put out a 400-page report on Avandia a few weeks ago, pointing out that a huge number of people in the FDA think it should come off the market. Just as the entire, I mean, now as opposed to when our meeting occurred in January, the entire Drug Safety Division now thinks that propoxamine should come off the market. So there's just lots of problems: funding, leadership, lack of congressional oversight. I would like to be able to go down to a 40-hour work week. The last time I worked 40 hours was like 50 years ago. That's my fantasy. The person who was going to take over, Peter Lurie, left and went to the FDA, much to my surprise and shock and everything. And I hope he's able to do as much as he could if they let him. But he's in the commissioner's office, and everyone is sort of hands-off drugs. No one is going to touch drugs. And so, if anything, the people on drugs are even more empowered than they were during the last administration, because some people thought that maybe they would try and change the leadership. They just haven't done it at all. So that's at least my view. Other questions? Yes. Tell me who you are. I knew who Judy was.
I'm from the Safety Surveillance Initiative at work. So my question is, do you get any help from the physician in Congress, like Ron Paul, and you mentioned one which is doing a good job?
Tom Coburn?
Yeah.
No, we don't. Tom Coburn's not interested in the FDA. No, we don't. I mean, we have good relations with key congressional committees, but for instance, Waxman's committee is generally very good. But Josh Sharfstein worked for that committee before he went to the FDA and before he became health commissioner in Baltimore, and they don't want to go criticizing him. And there's similar. There's a lot of let's cut some loose change for Obama. There's a great tendency not to want to criticize Obama, and criticizing the FDA, since it's his chosen commissioner and deputy commissioner, people aren't really up for doing that. Grassley is, but Grassley is in the minority and therefore can't hold any hearings. He held a hearing 6 years ago on Celebrex and Vioxx. It's the last serious drug-specific oversight hearing anyone's held. So, no, we don't. We have connections in the Congress, but they have to be willing. One person who seems to be interested, who I met with last week, is Congresswoman DeLauro from Connecticut. She's the head of the Appropriations Committee for the FDA, and I think she hopefully will hold some hearings to start getting at these issues. Other questions? Yes.
Just Mitch Krukoff here from Cardiology here. And I guess one of the key questions that seems to arise when a spotlight, even appropriately, is shined on safety-related issues and issues that need to be addressed is the counter-reaction of slowing innovation and adding cost to the development of new therapeutics that actually make it to the bedside in the United States as opposed to elsewhere in the world. Is there an approach to middle ground, and are independent groups like yours capable of helping us find that middle ground rather than just having reactions bang from one side to the other?
I don't think it's really necessary to identify a middle ground. We have never gone after any drug that looks like it's promising. I mean, ERISA we did because it turned out that it was approved by a surrogate marker of tumor shrinkage, and in 3 randomized control trials it never improved mortality. But mainly we are going with drugs that have absolutely no unique benefit. They're Me Too drugs, and the FDA is quite aware of and capable of distinguishing. We think that the drugs that really are breakthrough should be put on a fast track because they actually can provide the first therapy ever in some categories or a big improvement. So I think you can do both of them. One of the problems with PDUFA is that it puts even the Me Too drugs on a much faster track than is merited. I mean, some of these drugs shouldn't be approved at all. And certainly if the FDA was more careful and said, okay, we want to make sure that you do another safety study before we take a look at this, instead they just approve it and they say, okay, you can do a post-market study. It's a drug with no unique benefit. So I think that the more distinction is made, and I think that at the front end, people generally have a good idea whether we're talking about a breakthrough drug or not. So the breakthrough drugs, Godspeed, they should go through. I mean, AZT was approved 6 months after the new drug application was filed in 80, 81, whatever year it was. So I think that's what needs to happen. Other questions? Bob. Give that man the microphone.
Yeah, no, so we're glad you're here. This was, I agree with Judy, this is a terrific review for the group to hear. In the last renewal of PDUFA, they did provide the FDA some more teeth to demand and hold the companies accountable for these post-marketing studies. Have you noted any swing with that?
Well, what Dr. Herring is referring to is that up until now, the company could be told by an advisory committee of the FDA, do a post-market study, but there was no time frame for it. If they did it poorly or late or whatever, there's no penalty. They now have authority to penalize companies for that. But I think the larger problem is why are post-market studies being substituted for pre-market studies for drugs that we'd be much more comfortable learning about before they get unleashed on people. I mean, if there's really a safety issue and it's not a breakthrough drug, why do you want to just let it out in the whole country before you've answered the safety question? It's really too early to tell. I mean, that went through in 2007, and it only applied to drugs approved after that. I haven't tried to keep book on that at all. Other questions? Thank you for your good attention and questions, and